Happy Monday, everyone. This is our very first episode of LSND Live Community Conversations. I am the Executive Director at Legal Services of North Dakota and your host for this fun Monday morning program. We are talking to community leaders, nonprofit agencies, organizations, whoever wants to come share the resources they have from their organizations. And I'm very happy to have Michelle Rydz here from High Plains Fair Housing Center to talk about what High Plains does. So Michelle, please introduce yourself and tell us what High Plains does.
Sure. Hi, I'm Michelle Rydz. I'm the executive director and co-founder of High Plains Fair Housing Center. We're a nonprofit organization that works to enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act in the state of North Dakota and a little bit in the state of South Dakota. We do that through our advocacy program, which is if somebody feels like they've been a victim of housing discrimination, we'll reach out to them, or they'll reach out to us and we'll talk to them and we'll kind of determine whether or not their issue is based on a protected class. And if so, we can help advocate with their landlord or with their lender or real estate agent to make, to talk about what the fair housing, their fair housing rights are. We also have a testing program, which is kind of like secret shopping for real estate or real estate transactions. And that's where we send testers to gather evidence to determine whether or not discrimination is occurring. And that is upheld by the Supreme Court. It's completely legal. And it's really the only objective way you can determine whether or not discrimination is happening. If someone from a protected class and someone not from a protected class simulates a rental experience, if they're treated differently because of their protected class, we can identify discrimination that way. And then finally, we have an education and outreach program, and that's just letting people know what their rights are under the Fair Housing Act and what their responsibilities are under the Fair Housing Act. And we do that through a lot of workshops and, one-on-one trainings and booth events and all sorts of, hundreds and thousands of materials out throughout the state of North Dakota, just getting people to know what their rights are and responsibilities.
Reaching everybody as much as possible in all the different ways.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me how High Plains came about. How were you created?
Yeah, so actually we have origins here in Grand Forks, North Dakota, where I'm located, but we do have offices actually in Fargo and Bismarck. Our co-founder is Margaret Jackson, who's a professor of law at UND School of Law, and there had been no fair housing center in North Dakota for about 5 years. And what she noticed was that there was a drop in fair housing claims. And we know that when there's a drop in fair housing claims, it doesn't mean that discrimination isn't happening. It means that people don't understand their rights. And so she reached out to me. I have a background in organizational development and in grassroots community organizing. And at the time I was only working as a consultant. And she said, why don't you think about starting a FIP with me, a Fair Housing Initiative Program organization with me in North Dakota. And so it took us a little while. We gathered some leaders throughout the state. Some of our first funders were the city of Fargo, the city of Grand Forks, North Dakota Department of Commerce, and really just to have this presence of a fair housing center in North Dakota. So that's how we started.
That's how you started. Very cool. And we're glad you did. Very important topic and a very important legal right to be able to enforce. And I think it's often misunderstood. People don't understand what fair housing probably is. Can you give just like the basics of, and we can go on for hours, I know.
Yes, of course.
Just the idea of what people can be kind of looking for when it comes to fair housing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that you're right. One of the things that, we get a lot is that people will say, this isn't fair, right? So this thing that happened to me is in my rental situation, or this thing with my landlord isn't fair, and it may not be fair, but it doesn't fall under fair housing. And so a lot of times, what we do is we'll talk to people, we'll say that's not really fair housing. What fair housing is that you're treated differently based on based on a personal characteristic, right? So it's based on your race, based on your color, based on religion, based on your familial status, based on whether or not you have a disability, based on, did I say recession? So anyway, so there's the protected classes. Yeah. And then in North Dakota, we have additional protections of receipt of public assistance, age, and marital status. So if you're treated differently based on any of those protected characteristics, then you would fall under the Fair Housing Act, and then or the North Dakota Human Rights Act, and then we would Housing Discrimination Act, sorry, and then we would work with you on that issue. But sometimes people may think that people may think it's just a landlord-tenant issue, and then if we dig a little deeper, we'll discover it is fair housing. So it's always good to call us because we can kind of parse out what
Mhm.
happened. And then if it does sound like it's discrimination, we can use our testing program to kind of simulate the experience to see whether or not our testers are treated differently based on their personal characteristics. And then we can work with them throughout the complaint process.
I think that's a really important point because I tell people for legal services, call and ask because there's often things that we see that maybe the general public doesn't see. And so I think that probably applies to you all as well, where it's better to call and ask.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, for example, somebody may get non-renewed, and they're just non-renewed and they think it's unfair. And then we can talk to them. We can find out, oh, they have a child with autism who is, has making out loud noises. Then it could be, they're being non-renewed because of, the status of disability in their family. So that's the kind of thing that
Yeah.
we, help with and help parse out.
And what are some of the misconceptions you see out there about fair housing?
Uh, um, so misconception, I mean, I think, like I said, I think that people do sometimes if they just say, well, I was late on rent just twice, and that's really not fair that they're kicking me out because I told them beforehand that I told them beforehand that I was going to be late and,
Mhm.
they said, okay, but, so that kind of thing where
Not
it doesn't
really.
feel it's not based on a protected class, but people think, well, it doesn't feel it's not just. It doesn't
Right.
feel like it's just. So I think that's the main thing that we see is that people just not really understanding that when we talk about fair housing, we're talking about a protected class. We're talking about personal characteristics that you have no control over.
Yeah. And then one of the big topics that's come up recently is rural areas versus some of the more urban areas. Do you see different things happening in the more rural areas? Because I know you're statewide as well.
Yeah, we are statewide, and that is, of course, we always want to do more outreach to rural areas, in part because first of all, a lot less housing, and
Mhm.
so so it's very it's very hard to find affordable housing in the rural areas. People are out there but need housing, so that is one of the issues that we see a lot. But we also see that. I think property managers and owners don't have the same understanding of what fair housing is. And so they're just kind of used to running it the way they run it. And then they hear, oh, well, somebody's asserting their fair housing rights by asking for a reasonable accommodation, to pay their rent maybe 5 days late because their social security check comes late, that kind of thing. And the property manager landlord might, push back on that. So it's really kind of getting that information out there. And of course, in the rural areas, it's a lot. Um, the means of communication, the means of dispersion of communication is different. So we really do spend a lot of time trying to strategize on how we can do that. So during Fair Housing Month, we send, loads of materials throughout the state to all the libraries, all the community centers that we can find, just so that they can see, oh, it's Fair Housing Month, what's fair housing, and then they can maybe look it up, that kind of thing. So just getting that word out, I think, is really important. There are
Yeah.
some exemptions under the Fair Housing Act. One of them is owner occupied. If it's a four flat or under, for 4 unit building and under, and owner occupied, then they are not. They don't have to adhere to the Federal Fair Housing Act. So that's the other thing, that in rural areas we might see more of the
Hmm.
exemptions than we see in the bigger areas.
That makes sense. There's not gigantic apartment buildings or anything like that in
Right,
some of these more
right.
rural areas. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. No, I totally understand that trying to get the word out in some areas because you really do have to show up at a library or a community center or
right,
bring materials in because it's just not the same access that they have in other bigger cities.
right.
So,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Um, what are Are you seeing any specific housing challenges in North Dakota? The High Plains is running across.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned it with the rural areas. It's consistent with the with urban areas too. I mean, I think the amount of housing, affordable housing, is challenging, right?
Yeah.
I think that we have some other issues with people that have a background, like have a criminal background, and there's some blanket criminal background issues or that people aren't, that some companies have that they don't allow anyone with a criminal background. And so we are, we're definitely concerned about that because, that limits housing for people. And so then they end up in substandard housing. And if they're if they're with families, that makes it a lot worse.
Yeah.
Um, accessible housing, like so, getting how, people want to age in place, right? As we get older, our
Mhm.
physical capabilities are not static, right? Here, so keeping people older as they get older, keeping them in their house is important, and so that's really where the Fair Housing Act can really kick in terms of reasonable modifications. Talking to the landlord, talking to the property manager, getting those physical barriers removed so that people can age in place. And then, the accommodations, just again, getting people changes in rules and policies
Mhm.
in their in their unit and their rentals so that they can stay housed.
There's a lot to keep up with. There's all
It
these things
is.
that
It
change.
is. Yeah, exactly. And in North Dakota, which is consistent nationwide, over 70% of all the calls are related to disability. In North Dakota, we have an aging population. We have
Mhm.
a large military population that has, may have, and people, from those communities may have, PTSD, that kind of thing. And so, really working with all the folks in our community to keep them housed is really important.
But yeah, that's really important because I see a lot of the aging population. We're trying to help people get their wishes put down so that if they want to age at home, they
Yeah.
can make
Oh,
those
yeah.
wishes known and that kind of thing. So I think a lot of it all interlocks. And I tell people it's like a big puzzle where you have to put all the pieces together and then it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about your staff and what happens when someone calls in. Like what happens when someone calls in? Who's working your phones or is it online? How do people get a hold of you all?
Yeah, so we have a couple of ways you can reach us. You can reach us through there's an online, form that you can fill out that's on our website, which is highplainsfhc.org, or you can call our number, which is 701-203-1077. And that is just people will just talk you through your story. If we can tell right away that it may be a issue that's not fair housing related, then we'll probably, get you to someone who can help you. Oftentimes it's Legal Services of North Dakota. It may be, an organization that has, if you need emergency funding, maybe an organization that has emergency funding.
Mhm.
But what our intake staff will do is really talk through the story and find out whether or not there is that nexus between a protected class and the fact that whatever's happening to you. So we had one of our situations in Mandan where a woman was when she recertified for her voucher, noted that she was pregnant and she was non-renewed.
Mhm.
And it was very confusing. She had been paying rent on time. She was working, all the boxes were checked, and yet she was still non-renewed. And so after calling our office and kind of, talking it through with her, it was determined that she was non-renewed because she was pregnant, and it was a three-bedroom townhome, so it was quite large, and this
Yeah.
would have made the family six, so it would have really been two people per bedroom. So it was really an issue of definitely related to familial status, based on the fact that she was, family with children, and that's why she was not renewed. So just trying to figure that out. Those are sort of some of the things that we, can do when we talk to you.
And so to set expectations for people when they have a case, I'm always trying to do this on the legal side too, where I'm always trying to set expectations for timelines.
Yeah.
Do a lot of your discussions end up as almost negotiations with the landlord, talking through it, or do a lot of them go to like a lawsuit where it's going to take a lot longer time to figure out how does it work?
Yeah. So, generally, and I mean, something like, 95% of the cases are kind of a discussion with the landlord and coming up with
Okay.
a resolution, right? So we don't want to go through a complaint process. We don't want to go through a lengthy court process because, like in that story that I told you, that ended up going to a lengthy administrative process. And by the time that it was resolved, the woman, I mean, I think the baby was
She'd given
3,
birth.
the
Yeah.
woman was in different states, so that nobody wants that. People really, you want that resolution as quickly as possible. And so, yes, we try to, work with the landlords, work with the tenants, and come up with a good resolution to keep them housed. And we're
Yeah.
not lawyers. We have no lawyers on staff. So that's a longer, process also. Then we have to call legal services and ask them to join us or call another, outside
Yeah.
counsel. So it can be a much longer process for sure.
Yeah. I think people underestimate sometimes how long, if you actually have to file a lawsuit, that takes because it can take
Yes.
years sometimes to figure out. So
Right.
keeping people
Yeah.
housed is important. Yeah. Um, is there anything that tenants can do to protect themselves when they're applying for housing? Is there anything like best practices that you can, just a few tips there?
Yeah, I mean, we always say, have everything in writing, take a lot of pictures, whenever you're communicating with your landlord, if you do have a verbal communication, then go home and, type yourself an email or put it in notes. We do have a single party recording state, so you can actually tape record your conversations, and that's completely legal. You can't tape record other people's conversations, but if you're a party to the conversation, you can tape record it. Just I think document it and read your lease. I mean, that's the other thing is that I think I felt fallen in that trap
Yeah.
where somebody hands me a paper with a contract that's 3 pages long, and I'm like, I'm sure it's fine,
Yeah.
and then I'll just sign it, and then you're like, so that because a lot of times what we'll say is somebody will say, well, I got this notice, or and then we'll say, well, what does the lease say? What does the lease say about bug extermination? What does the lease say about, guests? So really pay attention. That's how you can protect yourself the best is just really pay attention to what your lease says and read it and or ask somebody else to read it, that kind of thing. So
And I always tell people like the best whenever someone calls into legal services or anything, I'm like, what does your lease say? That's like the first question we
yeah,
end up asking. It's
right,
like, what does your lease say about this problem? Because that is a
right.
contract, unless it's something that's
It's
illegal. Yeah,
yeah, exactly, right, right.
interesting. I know,
Mhm.
just to try to wrap some of this up, but I
Yeah.
know that you partnered with the law school and did a tenants' rights booklet or a download that's available on your website. Correct?
Yes.
Do I have that correct? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so it's an awesome. So it was the human rights law class. I
Okay.
think taught by Professor Jen Cook, and it's a first of all, I mean, it's long, right? But
It is.
it is pretty straightforward. It gives you, a really comprehensive look at what landlord-tenant law looks like in North Dakota because it's different in every state.
Mhm.
So what your rights are under landlord-tenant law, there's a little bit in fair housing, but it's really landlord-tenant law. And then there's a toolkit, which I really love, which just really kind of takes you through all the things you should think about as you're renting your apartment. So it's like, kind of taking a look at the condition of the stove, the blinds, the, washer and dryer, if there is one, the light bulbs,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So it's really just kind of helping you have a guide to when you walk into your apartment to, to see the condition it's in, and then that which will protect you on your way out, right? So
Yeah.
somebody can't say, you put a hole in the wall, so you have to pay for that wall being fixed when, you have a picture and you have it documented that that hole was already there. So those are, it's a really great tool, really great resource for
I
North
was really
Dakota.
impressed by it. I was really impressed when I saw it come out. So I will link to that in the description of
Oh,
our
perfect.
on the
Yes.
YouTube channel. But yes, I just thought it was such a
Good.
cool thing that you all came out with to describe
Yeah.
all the different rights out there, not just for housing, but landlord tenant law
Exactly.
in North Dakota.
And
Yeah.
they did all the, yeah, excuse me, and they did all the work, right? So we just said we would like this. So wasn't we so we did just like say, please do this. And they did it. And it
Yeah.
was a yeah, they're amazing group of students at the UNT School of Law. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's a good collaboration. I like collaborations like that where you say, hey, we're an organization who needs this, and there are law students or other
Yeah.
kinds of students too that can help put those things together. So it's a good collaboration.
Yeah.
Um, so any final thoughts? Anything you want people to know about High Plains? Anything that's
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, April is Fair Housing Month, and if you're in Grand Forks, we do have a month-long exhibit. We will have a month-long exhibit about housing, barriers to housing, and house in place. We're working with Arts for Vets with in that, and April 3rd is the opening night. And we have, kind of throughout the month of April, we will have a lot of, kind of fair housing, touch points. So you can learn about fair housing, little, kind of tidbits similar to this community conversation. So yeah, and just also April is the month, it's the anniversary. I think it's the 57th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act.
oh
So it
really?
was
Okay.
the Fair Housing Act was passed shortly after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So it was
Okay.
not it was really hard to get that Fair Housing Act passed because people did, really push back. They wanted to pass it in 1964, but it took another 4 years before it got passed. So another month of celebrations of fair housing. So,
Very good. Well, I will put a note of that as well and make sure if you're in
thank
Grand
you.
Forks that you attend those events. So thank you, Michelle. I appreciate your
Thank you.
time. I hope people reach out to you if they have any problems with any for housing issues because you are a great resource in the community. And thank you for participating in LSND Live.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.